Welcome back. In part 2 here, we're going to go step by step on how to add color to our image. So we have our line art. Let's start by adding a new layer. So once again, it's this button up here, create a new layer. And I'm going to double click on the name of the layer, and I'm going to call this layer color. So let's make sure this layer is behind our line art because we want our color to be behind the line. Okay, so let's choose what colors we're going to use. I'm going to quickly go over 3 ways that you can choose some colors for your drawing. The first way is using the color picker. So I'm going to go down here and click on this black square, which opens up our color picker. If you've ever done any kind of digital coloring before, you've probably seen something like this. Basically what we're looking at here is a chart that uses the 3 primary colors, which in this case are red, blue, and green, actually. You might have been expecting that third one to be yellow, and that would be true if we were using paint, but we're technically painting with light right now because, as we know, a computer screen is made up of a million tiny color-changing light bulbs called pixels, and for light, the primary colors are red, green, and blue, which you'll see abbreviated as right here as RGB. So let's open up a little color wheel. So we can see our 3 primary colors here, red, blue, and green, and red and blue combine to make purple, blue and green combine to make this sort of cyan tealish color, and red and green are going to combine to make yellow. You can see these sort of tertiary colors in between. You have your full wheel of options. Great, so back in our drawing, let's pick a color. I want the sun to be yellow, so I am going to grab the color picker. I'm going to use these 3 sliders here, R, G, and B, red, green, and blue. I'm going to turn red all the way up, and then I'm going to turn green all the way up. Perfect, so we have a pure, bright yellow, but I want kind of a golden, orangey yellow, so I'm going to try sliding that green slider back down a little bit. There we go, that seems nice. So in addition to the RGB sliders, there are these 3 sliders here, H, S, and B. Those stand for hue, saturation, and brightness. Let's start with brightness. We can slide our color from its brightest version up top all the way down to black. Saturation, on the other hand, lets us slide between the purest, most saturated version of a color down to gray. In this case, that's sort of a whitish, but you can see here with darker colors that becomes just the neutral gray version of that color. Then the third one here is hue, and this just gives you the full rainbow of options to pick from, so you can use that if you want to just pick a color from scratch. So let's get our yellow back. And great, so I'm gonna put this here. And the second way to pick a color is to use the brush tool like a painter's palette. So I found this yellow. I'm gonna use this brush. I'm gonna make a couple of dots of it. There we go. Now let's say I want this to be a little redder. I can take my brush and I can grab a red. So I'm going to turn the green slider all the way down, red all the way up. Now I can open up my tool options, which once again is down here. And I can turn down the opacity of my brush. So why don't I set it to 30? And you can see I can add a little bit of that color here. That's a little too orange, I think, so I'm going to do Command Z to undo. And I'm going to try on a less opaque opacity here. There we go. Okay, yeah, that's nice. And, let's say I want it to be bluer. I just need to grab that color instead. Well, I've got blue, and I can add that. It's a nice way to get a similar group of colors if you want a color scheme that's going to harmonize well. Finally, the third way to get a color for your image is to use the eyedropper tool. This is a tool you're going to be using all the time. It's right over here. I'll just hover over that so we can see the name. The color picker tool, I think it's called, but, looks like a little eyedropper. And what that tool does is it lets you click on an existing color and use that. So if I want to go back to my original yellow up here, I click it, and you can see that's now my active color. So what this lets us do is we can bring in a color from real life and we can use it in our image. So let's say I want to just Google the sun, right? And I can just copy and paste. So I'm just using Command V there. And you can see it came in as its own layer. If I put that above the line, you'll see it covers the lines now. Behind, it's as you'd expect. So I'm just going to grab a nice yellow from here. There we go. A word of warning for this method, though, just remember that things don't always appear in photos to be the color you'd expect them to be. Sometimes things are in shadow, sometimes they're under colorful light. The context and lighting makes a huge difference. But that said, the eyedropper is really useful. I use it all the time for things like skin tones and hair colors especially. Just remember not to trust it completely. You have to double check the color for yourself. If you're red-green colorblind like I am, that might be disappointing to hear, but remember you can always check the color out in the color picker if you're not sure what color it is. So you can look in here, right? And you can see what the RGB values are. You'll notice also there's two of these little squares. These are called the foreground color and the background color. And you can switch between them by pressing the X key on your keyboard. So that's just a useful way to have two colors available at once. Okay, so we've picked our yellow. Let's go with that original one. That's going to be our main color here. Now let's fill in the sun. So you might be thinking, hey, I know the paint bucket. Why don't I use the paint bucket, right? Just go like that. But that's not actually a great idea. I'm going to undo. We want to keep our lines isolated on their own layer. That's just going to keep our options open if we want to add any shading or change our mind later about the color we picked. Also, if we zoom in here, we can see, here, I'll refill it again. We can see it leaves us with these ugly little gray parts where our color meets our line. And I know that's pretty subtle in this case, but it's just one of those small things that makes your art look a little less professional. So there's a few things we can do instead. First and foremost is the brush. By the way, that shortcut I just used to zoom back to normal level is Command 0. So Command plus zooms in, Command minus zooms out, and Command 0 just fits it nicely to the window. So the brush. This is going to be our main tool for digital coloring. Here it is, over here we've been using it, and it works just like you'd expect. You can change the size, like we talked about, you can change the opacity. So if we want, we can just fill in our sun using the brush. And if you have a mouse or a drawing tablet, this is going to be pretty easy to use. Personally, I'm using a Wacom Intuos tablet, but you can do this with a mouse or even just with your laptop's touchpad. That said, this is obviously a little time consuming, so how do we get the equivalent of the paint bucket? For that, we're going to return to the magic wand tool, so let's go over here. So I want to start by just filling in the whole sun plain yellow. So I'm going to check that contiguous checkbox, which you'll remember from part 1. And I'm going to select all the parts of my sun. I'm going to make sure that I'm on the right layer, right? If I'm on the color layer, then it will just ignore the sun. So I'm going to be on the line layer. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to check all the parts of my sun. I'm going to select all of them. Got to get his teeth, the rays, the hand, water bottle, sweat drops. Okay, I think I got everything there. So now I can go to my color layer and make sure I'm not, screwing up my nice clean line layer. I want to keep that by itself. But we're still going to get that problem of those little pixely gray lines between the line and the color. We don't want that. So there's a simple way to fix that. It's buried up here in the Photoshop menus, and that's this. We're going to go to Select, Modify, Expand, and that's going to expand our selection. I recommend going by about 3 pixels, but that's working for the thickness of my lines. So experiment, see what works for you. So we can see the whole selection just expanded by a few pixels. So effectively, the outlines got a little skinnier. And now the part where the color finishes is going to be under the line. So we're not going to be able to see it anymore. And that's going to fix that little ugly aliasing problem for us. So I'm going to just go ahead and grab my brush. I'm going to make it really big. There we go. It's 1,000 pixels. And I can just draw in here, and we see it only affects the parts that are selected. You'll see I missed a few spots. That's totally fine. I'm just going to go in with my brush and get those. So there we go. And here you can see why it's important for the line layer to be in front of the color layer. Otherwise, we would get this. So this sort of shows you what the expand tool did. It made our color a little bit bigger than it otherwise would have been. But that's fine because it is behind our line layer. I also accidentally selected part of the drawing that shouldn't have been selected right here under the sun's armpit. And we can see why that happened. There's a break in my line art right here where the paint bucket sort of leaked out. And this happens all the time. Not all line art is going to be made up of closed shapes. In this case, I'm just going to take the eraser tool. And don't forget to make sure that your color layer is selected here. If you're not selecting the right layer, nothing is going to happen when you use the eraser. But what if there were more of those gaps in my lines? Well, you really have 2 options here. One is to draw with this problem in mind and make sure that all the parts of your drawing are closed shapes. The other, and this is what I recommend, is to lean less on the magic wand tool for coloring and more on the brush tool. Using the brush really is the right way to do it, and having a shortcut is great, and there's nothing wrong with that, but in my opinion at least, I don't want to be making changes to my drawing style just to accommodate what I see as a shortcut. So I know the brush tool can seem kind of tedious, but once you get used to it, it does get much quicker, especially if you have either a mouse or a drawing pad. Okay, so we've got a yellow sun looking good. In the next video, we're going to talk about adding in some detail and getting the rest of the way to the final image that you see here. So I hope you'll join me for that, and thanks very much.